Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, Wild Like a Flower Gardening. My name is Sarah and this is part 2 of my invasive species series for plant identification of the invasive species you do not want to have in your garden spaces, your backyards, your property as a whole. So this series is designed to help you as gardeners or landowners be more educated on invasive species plant identification and some of the basic removal techniques that you can use to keep them out of your growing spaces. So I'm going to cover Multiflora rose, honeysuckle, garlic mustard, and a few others that I see out here today, and also some of the equipment that you should have with you while you're out here surveying for what invasive species might be on your property. So let's get right into it. In part 1, I talked about some of the basic gear you need to take with you when you're out surveying for invasive species. So again, let's cover those. You want to have a pair of snips. If you're an avid gardener, you probably already own some, but if you don't, you want to go buy a really nice pair of sturdy snips. These ones are by Steel, and I used them last year, and I have slayed a lot of invasive species with this pair right here. My boss said that if I didn't lose them last year that I got to keep them, so haha. And they're really great. You may have to sharpen them a couple times, especially if you're using them a lot on some really woody shrubby species. But if you just have a really nice pair of sturdy garden snips, you will really be able to take samples and cuttings of some of the species if you're unsure of what you have, and it'll help you in your efforts to cut them back as well. So get yourself some really nice snips. Don't skimp on them. I know you can get some really inexpensive ones. In my experience, inexpensive snips, they break very early on, like maybe the third woody stem you're trying to cut, they're going to croak. So get yourself some nice snips. Especially if you're going to be working with species like Multiflora rose, barberry, or any of the other thorny species. Take some leather gloves with you, please, okay? They are very thorny, even if you're not working with the invasive thorny species. If you're coming across things like greenbrier or raspberry and blackberry brambles, leather gloves are going to be your friend. I have tried to, maneuver my way through thorny thickets before without any protective gear on, and I have definitely learned my lesson. Having leather gloves just makes everything so much easier. So get yourself some pair of leather gloves. You may already have some from working in the garden. Those would do just fine. Lastly, you want to have some flagging tape. You can also use various GPS units or apps on your phone to mark the latitude and longitude of where you're finding these invasive species, but you're not going to be doing a lot of the removal right now. You want to be waiting a little bit later in the season to be removing a lot of these species. So if you are just looking right now, you're going to notice that not a whole lot is green. I mean, look behind me, not much is leafing out yet. But here in 2 months, it's going to be a lot harder to see the invasive species if you don't tag them, because they're going to be mixed in with a lot of other greenery. So definitely bring some flagging tape. You can pick it up at Tractor Supply. Walmart probably has some. Wherever you find a lot of garden supplies, you'll probably find some flagging tape as well. Some of the apps that I have used that are really great are Avenza. Now, to use Avenza, you do need to find a map for your property. If you can download a county map, that will work as well, and then import it to Avenza. You could probably drop the pin on Google Maps and import it into Google Earth. Stuff like that would just really help you, especially if you have some really big patches of invasive species, so that way you can locate them when it's time to go back and remove and manage them. And if you're going to be hiring out a contractor to do the invasive species removal, it'll be a lot easier to show them exactly where you have these problem areas of invasive species so they can get right into that removal for you. So now that you know a couple of the really basic tools you need to have before you get out here, I'm going to get right into some identification. The first on the docket is Multiflora rose, just like last time. This Multiflora rose here, as compared to last week, you can just tell there is so much more green happening. This has only been a week's time, and it is really beginning to aggressively leaf out, ahead of a lot of the native vegetation. We do have some blackberry canes here, and they are not, these blackberry canes, the leaf buds are really thinking about it, but they're not leafing out yet. So the blackberry and a lot of the black raspberry is going to have a lot of a harder time photosynthesizing when the Multiflora rose surrounding it is shading it out, and getting a head start. So when you see Multiflora rose, it's really important to start tagging it with flagging tape, or put it on your GPS units or your apps, so that way you can remove it. Because if you want to encourage some of these native species, your native brambles, as you can tell the difference, Multiflora rose is already ready to go, and a lot of these native species, they're not ready yet, and they won't be maybe for like another 2 weeks at least. I'll definitely update you on some of these native species so you can see when they do officially leaf out. But I mean, Multiflora rose has already got its, head in the game. So this is a stark difference from only about a week ago. About a week ago, I was showing you guys that the leaves were just beginning to peek out, if not at all. And now we can really see these compound leaves beginning to develop, and you can also see some of the identifying characteristics that separate Multiflora rose from some of our native roses. One of the most common ways to identify Multiflora rose compared to our native rose species are the fringe stipules at the base of the petiole of the leaves. So if you look closely right in here, this is where these fringe stipules are beginning to develop. We bring it a little closer. So you see how fringy that is? As this develops, those are going to be a lot more obvious. I've got some good photographs that I'm going to link in the video so you guys can get a closer look. But this is something to continue to watch for as the shrubs continue to leaf out. If you're unsure, if you can't quite tell if these are fringed yet, give it honestly like 1 more week, and these leaves will be far more developed and those fringe stipules be very obvious. And that's a really great identifying characteristic to determine if you have a native rose that you would like to keep or the Multiflora rose that you need to remove. Something that I'd like us to take a closer look at here is the development of some of these leaves. Now, they don't look particularly healthy, do they? I believe this is a beginning stages of the rose rosette disease that plagues Multiflora rose, and I'd have to do some research to figure out if it also affects our native roses. But I remember working last year at the nature preserve where my boss would get kind of excited when he would see Multiflora plagued with this rose rosette disease, because it's going to make this plant struggle to photosynthesize and make it a lot harder for it to be successful and to take over the landscape. Now, if you're seeing Multiflora rose that's really plagued with this disease, it will probably make it a bit easier for you to combat and remove, but I wouldn't leave it on the landscape just because you think the disease may polish it off. You should still go ahead with your removal techniques and definitely tag it so you can monitor the shrub to see if that rose disease knocks it out, or if you are going to have to return with some of those, more advanced removal techniques. So you can see it's a lot more red and kind of looks shriveled as compared to, these healthier leaves that are leafing out and beginning to photosynthesize. So here we have bush honeysuckle. I told you guys that I would find us some to have a look at, and thankfully I've been able to locate some. So just looking at it from afar, you can see that the branches kind of have this arching look to them. They sort of come out and create this V shape. You can see it in both of these shrubs here. It goes both one to the right, one to the left, and that's a characteristic I've seen with most bush honeysuckle shrubs. You can see here that we do have some green leaves coming out now that it's nice and warm, and we will be getting a closer look at some of the other identifying characteristics, such as that hollow stem when you take a cutting and look at that cross section, so that way you can tell the difference between bush honeysuckle and privet. Okay, so to determine if you're looking at bush honeysuckle versus privet, if you're unsure, you want to cut the stem. So here you can see, even though it's really small, there's a bit of a hollow center to the pith of this shrubby stem. That is going to indicate that you have bush honeysuckle instead of privet. Privet will not have a hollow center to its stems. So that is one of the best characteristics to determine which of the shrubby invasives you have, so you can then determine which treatment method you need to go ahead with. Here are some of those leaves already beginning to leaf out. And like I said, with both bush honeysuckle and the vine, Japanese honeysuckle, you've got opposite branching, opposite leafing. So we've got leaves on this side and they mirror itself on the other side. That is very characteristic of honeysuckles. So I was smart this time and I wore pants instead of shorts, but granted it's a lot more like March than it was a week ago. A week ago it felt kind of like summer, so today I'm wearing long pants to help myself get down in these little shrubby areas to get a closer look So here you can see the bark on bush honeysuckle is really peely. It's kind of a light tan color, and you're going to see this kinds of bark on bush honeysuckle, wherever you find it. This is exactly what I've seen in other locations, just this really peely, tan, light colored bark. And again, down here, you can really see how developed these stems are. This bush, as left to its own devices, is really establishing itself, making it harder for, landowners and land managers to remove. Over here, we have the bush that's right next to the one that I was taking a look at. Again, it's got that light tan, really peely bark. Look at the size of the trunk. That is pretty well established. To come in here and cut this, you're either going to need to be very motivated with a hand saw, or what I used last summer was a weed blade. So you can get adaptations to your weed whackers and put a blade on it. Now you are going to need to be extremely careful with those. They're a little intimidating to use, and I did have some frightening experiences where the weed blade, when you push it into the shrub that you're intending to cut, sometimes it would bounce back off. So you need to be extremely careful. If you're working with partners, or other people, you want to make sure that when you are operating equipment like that, that nobody is standing near you, because sometimes that equipment does have a mind of its own, and you want to make sure you're wearing the correct protective equipment to keep yourself safe. But weed blades were really great, so you don't have to bend over, spend an hour with a handsaw cutting through this. It just kind of chopped right through. And then if you are using any type of herbicide, or you're going to use any light covering methods to try to, kill any re-sprouting, it makes it so much easier, so you can devote your attention to that instead of having to sit here with a handsaw. Now, if that's all you have is a handsaw, it'll work really well. You just want to cut as low as possible to the ground and cut all of the stems that you see coming out of the ground that belong to the particular, plant that you're trying to kill. I've never really seen honeysuckle leaf out like this directly from one of the main stems. Looking up, I see a lot of the leaves coming directly out of some of the more mature stems. So I wonder why it's doing that. If anyone has seen that before and knows why, let me know. It kind of reminds me of when you see trees that are really struggling when they do those epicormic sprouts. But I don't think that's what's happening here. But this is very interesting. If you know what's happening here, comment down below and let me know. Alrighty, everybody, so this is a species I want you all to really pay attention to. I want your listening ears on 100% for this one, because not only is this an invasive species, it is also a poisonous species. Now, if you're looking at the leaves and it looks a bit familiar to you, it may because this is in the carrot family. So this is poison hemlock. It has those highly serrated leaves, much like parsley, carrots, Queen Anne's lace, because they're all related. Now, if you are getting into wild edibles, or you really like Queen Anne's lace and sometimes you encourage it, which, side note, don't yell at me, but Queen Anne's lace is also not a native species. It has naturalized itself, but it's not native to North America. But if you like to encourage it, you need to know what is Queen Anne's lace and what is not. Now, poison hemlock, it has those very similar leaves, but there are characteristics that will set it apart from Queen Anne's lace. These are rather young, but they do have some characteristics that are synonymous with it as it continues to grow, and we're going to take a look at those. Now, before I stick my hand in here, I want to stress that if you are even attempting to identify whether you have poison hemlock or not, you need to be wearing gloves. Now, I don't have latex gloves, but what I would prefer is to wear my leather gloves with latex gloves over top to keep my leather gloves clean. The residue from this plant, if you were to break the stem, is what is rather poisonous. That's why you can't eat this plant. So you want to make sure that you have protective equipment on your hands. If you're doing any real removal, you may even want to protect your eyes and face so you do not risk ingesting it, because if you get it on your hands and then you touch your face or your mouth in particular, you may get very sick. So, taking a look in here at the base of this plant, you can see a lot of splotchy purple coloring. It almost reminds me of rhubarb. So this splotchy purple coloring is what is very indicative of poison hemlock, not Queen Anne's lace. So if you see purple splotching anywhere along the stem, it is most splotchy at the base, but as the plant gets taller, you will see it continue up the stem until it flowers. So that purple splotching is very, very, very indicative that you have poison hemlock. You don't even need to get this close. You can usually see the purpley stems from afar. I'm only sticking my hand in here because I want to make sure I can get it on camera. So if you see that it has the purple splotching, you likely have poison hemlock. Now I'm going to pan back here. Do you see all of this green? That is all poison hemlock. Now poison hemlock is a short-lived plant. It'll have this basal growth, and then it'll shoot up a plant stalk, flower, and drop a jillion seeds. Those jillion seeds live in the seed bank and cause a monoculture like this. A monoculture, if you are unfamiliar, a really great example would be to think of a cornfield. When you see one type of plant monopolizing the landscape, that is a monoculture. And we don't typically want that in nature. We want a lot of heterogeneity. We want a lot of variety on the landscape, so that way we're providing different host plants, different food sources. It's just not ideal to have one plant dominating the landscape. And something with these invasive species as a whole is the majority of them will create a monoculture, which isn't good. So you can see here we have this ocean of poison hemlock. Not great. Now, another characteristic of poison hemlock, if you're not sure if you have poison hemlock or Queen Anne's lace. Now, Queen Anne's lace will probably only get up to your waist. Poison hemlock will get extremely tall. Now, I'm a whole whopping 5'5". I think I outed myself in the last video. And my head stops about here. That's where my head is. Look at how much taller that is. Now this is what's called a vestige. This is from last year's plant growth. Now I don't foresee myself getting sick from touching it, but again, you do want to make sure you're not touching your face, eyes, mouth, that kind of thing after messing around with poison hemlock. But this is the vestige from last year. We've got quite a few of them. They look sort of like trees that haven't leafed out yet. To be honest, if you're unfamiliar with what a vestige looks like compared to trees, but so that really helps you if you have the new growth for this year paired with these extremely tall vestiges. That indicates that you have poison hemlock on your property and you want to make sure you remove it. It's a danger to you, it's a danger to your children, and it could be a danger to your pets. If your pets like to roll in it, if they like to eat plants, what have you, this is very dangerous. This is what killed Socrates, I'm pretty sure. So you want to make sure you're removing it. Some basic removal techniques for this. You can pull the plant out of the ground. It's going to have a root like a carrot, so it's rather easy to remove, and that will obviously kill the plant right there. Now you do have to consider you will have a lot of the seeds in the seed bank, so you will probably need to be doing some sort of mat covering on the ground to help kill any of the seeds that are beginning to germinate. You will lose some of the other seeds you do want in your seed bank, but I think when you're dealing with a monoculture this serious, it's probably better to address the poison hemlock and just reseed with native varieties at a later time. Now, if you do end up attacking poison hemlock a little late in the game, and it has grown really tall and is flowering, one of the best things you can do, now you're going to make sure you have your gloves on, and if you think that your face may be at risk, you want to cover your face. I mean, we're in the age of COVID-19. We all have face masks. Throw on a disposable face mask. Throw it away when you're done. Put that over your mouth and nose to protect your face from any of the residue that could be getting, in your mouth. And cut the flowering parts off, because that will prevent it from seeding. So if you don't have the opportunity to come out and pull them out of the ground, you want to at least prevent it from dropping its seeds. So you want to cut it while it's flowering. If it has already gone to seed, the more you mess with it, the more chances you have of dispersing those seeds anyways. So if it has already gone to seed and started to drop those seeds, it's better to move on with your removal techniques and not attack the seeds and the seed heads because your opportunity for that has kind of passed. So if they're flowering, cut the flowers right off, and you want to put them in a garbage bag, and you want to take that garbage bag and you want to make sure that it does not end up in any of your compost efforts. This is not plant material you want to be putting in your compost bin. please just keep this plant material away from anything that you may be working with at a later time, or anything that you may at any point ingest. Because if you're going to put in your compost material and you go out barehanded to mix it or whatever you're going to do, you're going to pull some out to use, you just want to make sure you're not coming into any contact with this plant material, because I can't promise you that you won't get really sick. So make sure that if you're removing it, that you are taking the appropriate precautions. If you have poison hemlock taking over in a really big monoculture like this, you may want to be consulting a contractor in your area, because those contractors will likely be able to advise you on large-scale methods of removal, or you will be able to hire them to come out and remove these species, because once they are really established, it's very difficult to remove them. And again, with this plant being as poisonous as it is, I really feel that it is best to take as many precautions as possible, because I don't really want any of you guys getting sick. So poison hemlock, very bad, very aggressive, jillion seeds in the seed bank, gets really tall, much taller than Queen Anne's lace. You can see that vestige there, way over my head. So if you've got this on your property, definitely tag it for removal and, keep the kids out of this area. Alrighty, so this is another invasive species that tends to form a monoculture. It's not doing that in this area just yet. I think it's a little early in the season to be seeing it, forming that monoculture. But this here is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard, this is a nice, rosette. You want to be keeping an eye on garlic mustard because it is very aggressive. Much like that poison hemlock, once you have garlic mustard establishing itself, it's really going to take over and just carpet, the ground on your property, which cuts out a lot of opportunity for native plants, and it will just perpetuate itself with that seed bank. If you have found what you think is garlic mustard but you're not entirely sure, another really great way to check is to pull off one of the leaves. Now, garlic mustard gets its name specifically for its garlicky and mustardy flavor and smell. So go ahead and pick one of the leaves, crush it up. I wish I could do smell-o-vision for you guys, and give it a sniff. It's not going to be as pungent as something like an arugula that you would be growing in your garden, but it is going to have a real garlicky and mustardy smell, as opposed to when you crush up a generic leaf that doesn't have much of a smell. You can really just tell the difference. So if you're removing garlic mustard on your own property and you've done the sniff test and you know that it's garlic mustard for sure, I know some folks will eat it. It technically is a wild edible, but I will say as a disclaimer, you want to make sure you are doing your own research. Please do not eat anything if you are not 100% sure that it is the species you are targeting and that it is in fact edible. Like we talked about with poison hemlock, you do not want to mistake it for wild carrot or any other edible species like parsley that you think you want to eat. Do your research and check. And if you have somebody that you know that's really into wild edibles, or you can attend a workshop or attend like an online Zoom, you want to make sure that you are really preparing yourself before you take anything home to eat it. But garlic mustard, if you are harvesting a lot of it on your property, I know folks that have turned it into a pesto. So if you're harvesting, all this garlic mustard, you might as well put it to use, and eat it. So, do the sniff test, crush it up, and make sure it's garlic mustard before you eat it. But, there are some ways to utilize it so it's not just strictly going into the compost bin. Kind of cool, right? Alrighty guys, so this is why I wore pants today, because I'm getting down in the nitty-gritty of it. So here I'm sitting on a lot of garlic mustard as well, but I've got this little patch of the garlic mustards that have flower buds, so we know they're going to be this year's problem children. So when you go ahead and pull garlic mustard, again, you want to target your efforts for the ones that will be flowering this year. If you're going to be bending over and getting a sore back, you want to be getting the most, positive impact out of your pain, so target these plants that are flowering this year. These have flower buds on them. You can tell compared to earlier, like I said, the rosettes, they're just getting a lot taller and they're overall just skinnier, and they're, really trying to get some height so that way when they, their seeds mature and they go to disperse, they can really kind of cover as much ground as possible. So when you're pulling garlic mustard, you want to really grab it down at the base as much as possible. And you don't want to twist because you're trying to get that taproot out and tact as much as possible. Kind of like if you're harvesting a carrot. So there's one. I kind of broke the tip off, but I got the majority of this taproot here. You can see it there. Haha, success. Okay, so this will give you an idea of how long that taproot is. This taproot really allows this plant to be quite mature and just take off and put on as much seeds as possible. Now these are relatively small plants for garlic mustard. I guarantee you when I come back to this in maybe like another couple weeks, these plants will be twice, maybe 3 times the size. But that root there is what you're aiming for, okay? Now, when you're pulling them, if you feel like the plant is going to break and you're only going to get it here where the vegetation meets the soil, maybe come back at a later time. Check the forecast, see if it's going to rain, because the more moist the soil is, the easier it is to wiggle these guys out of the ground. That's a little guy. There's another little guy. Now when you're out here and you're doing garlic mustard removal, you want to bring a bag with you so that way you can take this plant material out of the location you're working in. Because if you were to just leave these plants right here, you pull them, you drop them on the ground, and you head home, those taproots may be able to connect with the ground just enough to continue to develop those seeds and drop seeds back into the soil, making all of your efforts kind of pointless. So you want to be bagging these and taking them somewhere else to make sure that they die. Now, when I worked for the nature preserve this summer, we put them in, black trash bags, and we let the sun just bake them until they were absolutely dead, and then we put them in a designated compost area where they were not capable of regenerating more plant species. If you happen to be out, I see this a lot on the bike path, people who have been walking on the bike path and seen a patch of garlic mustard, pulled it, and then they left it on the bike path in particular to dry out and die. Now, that's not really ideal because, you don't really want to be leaving piles of plant material on, areas where people are recreating. I like to rollerblade. I know that became a huge quarantine trend. People love to rollerblade and roller skate now. And when I'm rollerblading, if I hit the tiniest twig, rock, or plant material, I will literally face plant. It's happened. And so you want to be making sure that you're not causing a problem for people who are outside and recreating, and it also, for people who don't understand what you were doing, may cause people to think that it's okay to just pull plants and just leave them. So, but if that is the only option that you have, is to pull the garlic mustard and leave it on, a hard surface where the roots will not be able to connect with the soil again, and let the sun bake them until they are absolutely roasted and dead, you can go ahead and do that. I've seen that. I know plenty of natural resource professionals who will do that, especially if they themselves are out recreating and they didn't bring anything. But if you know that you are going to be doing a designated garlic mustard removal activity, you want to bring a bag with you so that way you can pack them out of the areas that you're removing these in. Especially if you intend to do a pesto, then you can take it home with you and, go ahead and see what kind of recipes you can work with. So it doesn't take very long when you're removing garlic mustard before you have a lot of it. So again, this would be enough if you've ever made pesto with basil. This would be enough to go ahead and try a recipe. But as you can see around me, I have pulled quite a bit, and I'm still kind of surrounded by it. So something that's important to keep in mind if you are doing garlic mustard removal, especially of the flowering plants, is that you want to remove every garlic mustard plant that you see. It's okay if you have to come back the next day or later in the week, but you want to remove every single one of the flowering plants, because even one left behind will cause a problem because they can drop hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds. So you want to be making sure that you're not just pulling a couple and then leaving the area. You want to come back and do a lot of intensive removal and pull every single flowering garlic mustard that you see, because if you leave them behind, your efforts were kind of, all for naught. So ensure that you are tagging the location and making sure you know where exactly to come back to, because I guarantee you, your job is not done in one afternoon. And this is a really great opportunity for you to get your friends together and do garlic mustard pulls as a group of people. That's why there's a lot of volunteer events with the park systems, because it takes a lot of people to pull as much of the garlic mustard as you can see on the landscape. So, recruit your friends, get your kids involved. Garlic mustard is a nice plant species to remove. You don't particularly need to wear gloves. It doesn't really irritate my skin. If you don't like getting, dirt on your hands, or you are worried you could be sensitive, then yeah, you may want to wear some gloves. But overall, it's a really simple species to remove, and you may even be able to get an edible snack out of it. So again, do your research before you do any eating of garlic mustard. Make sure you don't have any food allergies. But this is a plant that, you can get some benefits out of from spending an afternoon removing it. And it prevents it from creating that stupid monoculture that cuts out a lot of, our spring ephemerals and other wildflowers that you want to see in your backyard or on your property as a whole. So say no to garlic mustard, kids. Get it out of here. So this right here is an autumn olive shrub, this big guy. Now, as you know, I've outed myself for being a little on the short side, so I just kind of wanted to point this particular shrub out so you can see how large it can get. This is like the trunk of a young tree, and this, if left on its own, will just continue to get massive and shade out a lot of the native vegetation below on the forest floor and prevent other native shrubs from growing here. If you look down here at this trunk, this is very big. This is something that you would not want to use a handsaw to cut through. You may not even be successful with a weed blade. This is a shrub that may actually require a chainsaw to cut it back, so that way you can get the majority of the top growth out of the way, so you can move forward with your other removal methods. Here we have two invasive species competing with one another. We have that Japanese honeysuckle vine really trying to make its way to the sunlight on top of this autumn olive shrub. So let's get a closer look at both of them. Here you can really see this Japanese honeysuckle vine wrapping around the autumn olive branches. The honeysuckle has these really oval leaves, that opposite branching and opposite leafing where the leaves will come out and mirror each other on both sides. When you come across honeysuckle vines, you will see this very characteristic wrapping that it does, and it will even wrap around itself as it's doing right here. Now, we talked about that kind of tan, flaky bark on that bush honeysuckle. That's going to be the same for the honeysuckle vine. You can see that here really well. And it's wrapping around itself and wrapping around the autumn olive. We've got all these leaves here, very oval leaf shape, and a nice green color to it as compared to the lighter green and shine that the autumn olive has. Now, only a week ago was I pointing out autumn olive that was simply leaf buds. It was not leafing out. So this is about a week's growth, if that gives you any idea of how fast this process happens. And I talked a lot about how the leaves will have a lot of speckles to them and a silver shine underneath. If you look closely, you can see a lot of that speckling on the leaves. When we flip these leaves upside down, you can see that it is even lighter underneath. And if you look closely, again, you can see a lot of that speckling and the speckling on the twigs along with that silvery shine. That is very characteristic of autumn olive. Now, when we looked at honeysuckle, we talked about how it has opposite branching and opposite leafing. Autumn olive has alternate. You can see that there are leaves on this side, but there are not leaves directly on the other side. They are a bit farther down the stem. That is another characteristic to help you determine if you have autumn olive or if you're looking at one of the honeysuckle or privet shrubs. But overall, you're really looking for this silvery shine on the branches, leaves, and the flowers, along with this speckling color on the leaves, fruit, flowers, and even on these stems. This is a really good shot of the speckling on that stem and the speckling and that silver shine on those leaves. Now, I will come back to autumn olive because it's going to eventually flower and it's going to give us bigger leaves, which will then help you really identify autumn olive in your backyard or your growing spaces. So once you find it, it is important to tag it or put it in one of your GPS apps, because as you can see here, like I said in my last video, birds of a feather flock together. We've got honeysuckle vine climbing up this autumn olive. So you don't just have one invasive species, you have two. And so you really want to make sure you're managing your autumn olive, because all it really does is provide structure for this honeysuckle vine to climb up, which is no good either. Thank you guys so much for joining me once again on an adventure to identify invasive plant species. Just to recap, we covered Multiflora rose, we looked at those fringe stipules, which will show you that you have Multiflora rose as compared to some of our native rose species. We took a look at bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, we looked at poison hemlock rather in depth, and we talked about how poison hemlock is very dangerous to you, so you want to make sure you are wearing the appropriate protective equipment or hiring a contractor for large-scale removal. We took a look at garlic mustard rosettes, and we actually found some that are putting on flower buds for this year. And then we covered how to remove garlic mustard as well, because 'tis the season for hand pulling those flowering garlic mustard stalks. If you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to drop them in the comments, or you can connect with me on my Instagram. It's the same as my YouTube name, Wild Like a Flower Gardening. I would love to answer your questions on invasive plant removal or identification. It's something that I have, logged a lot of hours doing in my career as being a natural resources field technician. So I can definitely chat about it, and if I don't have answers for you folks, I definitely have contractors in my network that I can reach out to and get you guys even more informed answers if I personally don't have that answer for you. So I hope you enjoyed this, I hope you learned a little bit, and I hope you get outside and you go find those invasive species so we can get them out of there. In a perfect world, you wouldn't find any invasive species in your yard. But let's be honest, they're everywhere, and at this point, you'd be hard-pressed to find property that doesn't have, a couple invasive species hiding on it. So get out there, identify them, tag them, put them in your GPS apps, pull that garlic mustard, get it out of here, and join me on the next video for more identification and some basic removal techniques. Because as we get later in the season and it becomes the appropriate time to be removing these species, we're going to talk about it so we can get them the heck out of here. So thank you for joining, and happy gardening.